Final Destination, a franchise that made an entire generation afraid of driving behind log trucks. My name is Kay Chamberlain. Welcome to my channel where I talk about comic books, usually Marvel and DC. But this week I'm going to be talking about a horror comic book, Final Destination Spring Break, which was released alongside the third Final Destination movie on its DVD as extra content. The series is written by Mike Calvoda with art by Len Medina and follows a group of friends as they travel to Cancun to celebrate spring break, but unfortunately some bad things happen and they end up on death's list. If you don't know what Final Destination is because you're living under a rock, Final Destination is a franchise about a character who has a premonition of a group of people dying. They warn these people, the people survive, and because they were supposed to die, death starts coming after them, killing them off one by one, usually in crazy and insane ways. The first movie was incredibly successful and spawned 4 sequels, some of which I love.
Then you can just drop fucking dead.
Some that I don't.
Deja vu. My wife said that deja vu is like God's way.
And, yeah, it was even popular enough to spawn a comic book as well, which is this one. There's also several novels of Final Destination that were released too, and they all share the same premise of the movies. They are essentially just movies, but in comic book and novel form. But, as much as I'd love to ramble on about the movies for hours, given how much I love them, we're not here to do that today. We're here to just talk about Final Destination Spring Break. So without further ado, let's just get straight into it. Our story begins with Carly Hagan. She's getting ready for a trip to Cancun with her friends Brian, Jake, Amanda, Matt, Chris, and Katie. They're going to be going to Cancun to celebrate spring break, and it also just happens to be Carly's birthday as well. Her friend Amanda comes over to greet her and talks about how Carly's hands are suspiciously cold, even though the AC hasn't been turned on. So they head off to the airport and board the plane, and while Carly is on the plane, she thinks that she sees the plane on fire, but it turns out that it isn't, and she's just having a weird vision, or a hallucination. There's a couple of other signs that we get of that are suspiciously weird, you know, like she puts down a couple of cards and it's black aces and black aces over black eights, which have its own meaning. So Carly gets woken up by her boyfriend Brian, who looks a lot like Mark Wahlberg, and they arrive in Cancun. They go to a nearby liquor store to get some alcohol, and then they get on a bus where the carnival just happens to be going on. Carly looks out a window of the bus and sees a skeleton, which is quite ominous. And then they head over to their hotel, where they are introduced to this woman named Esperanza, who is going to help them, you know, find their room. She gives Carly a room key. And then they just decide to relax for the rest of the day. Matt goes swimming with the ladies, and then after that, they decide to sit around the table and celebrate Carly's birthday by giving her a birthday cake. Also, there's one weird moment where one of the characters, Chris, is playing around with a fire alarm, and one of the attendants has to come up to him and be like, hey, don't play around with that. It's not to be played around with. So they light Carly's cake, and they all start singing Happy Birthday, and Esperanza comes up to her and says, make a wish, sweetheart. And so Carly blows out the cake, and then all of a sudden it explodes, killing a whole bunch of people around her. The boiler room begins leaking gas, and that causes the rest of the hotel to explode, killing everybody in the hotel. We see a lot of people dying in different ways. It's kind of hard to make out how some of these people are dying, but one of them is apparently an elevator. One of them is somebody dying on a balcony. Somebody gets crushed by the head of a totem. And then we cut back to the airplane because this was a premonition that Carly was having. She begins sweating. She's woken up by Brian. And then one of her other friends, Jake, comes over to check in on her, and there's a bit of a love triangle between Carly, Brian, and Jake, because Brian is her boyfriend, but Jake like, cares about her and is obviously trying to get with her. Carly tells everyone that she's had a premonition, that she's seen all of them die at the hotel, and Brian just tells her to calm down and that she's just seeing things and they're just going to continue on with their trip because obviously her dream doesn't mean anything because none of these characters have seen the other movies or, I guess, heard of Flight 180 or anything like that. I don't know if the events of the other movies take place in this comics universe. So everything plays out as normal, except this time Carly is getting flashbacks to things that she saw, like the skeleton on the bus and Esperanza giving her the key and things like that. It all plays out normally. You know, we get the cake, they light it on fire, only this time, instead of blowing out the cake's candles, Carly asks if anyone has, like, if she's got anything for, like, if they've got anything to give her for her birthday. And Jake jumps in and is like, hey, sure, like, come up to my room. And Carly's like, you promise, right? And so it's basically just her way of trying to get out of the hotel as quick as possible. So Carly gets up with Jake and her friends, and they all leave the hotel, but then Carly says, like, where's Esperanza? Did she leave as well? And they're like, nah, she's fine. And that's when the hotel blows up, killing Esperanza and sending Carly and her friends flying backwards. And they just look in horror at this explosion because it's exactly what Carly said would happen. So all the firemen and stuff arrive, ambulances, and this detective shows up, Detective Garcia, who just asks them if they're terrorists, and Carly is like, no, we're not terrorists. And a representative from the US Embassy shows up, Sue Flanders, and she confirms that they had just flown in and that there's no way they could have done this, and that they've got to decide whether or not they're going to remain in Mexico, because if they do, they're going to have to be detained because they are alien citizens. Carly explains to them that she had a vision, and Sue is just like, oh, you had a vision? Wow, okay. Like, that's cool. But that's not what we're going to focus on right now. We're focusing on the fact that there could have been a terrorist attack. And then it kind of ends on a lighter note where Carly and her friends are just sitting on a wall, staring out the ocean. They're all like, oh, look at that beautiful view. It's amazing. You know, Carly's vision has given us a chance at new life, and we got to take that opportunity and live it to the fullest. And so everyone kind of comes in together and they all hug each other. They're all like, thank you, Carly. Like, if it weren't for you, we'd be dead right now. And all Carly can do is just look out into the ocean and stare because of what she's been through. Carly finds a new unit in Mexico alongside Brian, and they go there to chill. Carly tries to use diphenhydramine in order to give her peace of mind over the situation she's been in, but that isn't going to help at all, because that just helps the cold and stuff. Meanwhile, Brian's on the phone with his dad, you know, telling him how much he loves him and stuff, because he's recently just survived a horrible situation. And that's when Brian asks Carly whether or not they're going to stay in Mexico. And that's when Sue shows up in order to talk to Carly, where she reveals to Carly a drawing that Carly had drawn earlier that was the exact match of the fire path from the hotel explosion. And so Carly grabs it off of Sue and she looks at it, and that's when Brian tells her that everyone's gone parasailing and that they left a message for him. So Carly and Brian get into a taxi, and Brian's like, hey, do you want to go to the Mayan ruins? It's like something you think you might want to see. And that's when Carly decides to bring up the drawing where she said, she saw the hotel explode, and then there's that drawing that she drew of the path of the explosion. And then she starts sketching out on another pad. She's like, I've been seeing other things too, having other visions. And she draws out a weird symbol of 2 arrows. So Brian and Carly head to the parasailing area where they meet up with the rest of the group. Chris, who's kind of a dick, decides to try and scare Katie with a fish, which is just weird. She's like, "Hey, you're disgusting." And then they head out on the boat, and Jake At least I think it's Jake, because I get Jake and Brian mixed up all the time because they almost look exactly the same. Sometimes one of them looks like Mark Wahlberg, and then sometimes the other one looks like Mark Wahlberg, and it seems to swap between them. I don't know why, but the art is not consistent. So they head out on the boat. Jake is parasailing, and they start turning in it, like they start going around in a circle like a whirlpool. So this is kind of hinting, you would think like, oh, Jake's the one who's going to die, because Carly's suddenly like, oh, something's wrong, stop the boat. And Matt's just like, what? And it causes the boat to like jolt up, and they're just like, ugh. And so Jake looks up, and he sees that his parasail, like his sail, has a rip in it. So you're like, oh crap, like Jake's gonna die. And they're heading straight for a bunch of rocks. She's like, look out! And so like Jake's trying to undo the parasailing gear so that he, you know, can get back onto the boat. Chris sees the motor of the boat, and so Jake is like, shut it off! And Chris goes to try and shut off the motor, and he turns and looks behind him, and he sees the rope of the motor, and it says end of the line on it. And then all of a sudden the rope slaps, the motor goes falling off of the boat, and the blades fly directly into Chris's back because he falls over. The blades fly directly into his back, just ripping his spine to shreds in front of everyone. All his blood just goes splattering all over their faces. And they crashed the boat on the beach. And so, yeah, it wasn't Jake that was going to die. It was Chris. So they head to the hospital where Katie's kind of messed up after what happened to Chris, because it was kind of hinted that they had a little bit of a thing. And so she has to go to another room in order to, you know, chill out. And that's when Garcia comes in order to talk to Carly about what happened and the fact that she saw visions of Chris's death without even realizing, because that symbol that she drew on the piece of paper was the same symbol that was on the motor that killed Chris. And she notices that when they show her photos of Chris's death. Now I've had 2 premonitions of people's deaths. Like, what's happening to me? She says that she doesn't just see them, she also feels like something is going to happen, and then they do. It's like, it sounds ridiculous, but what if it truly was our fate to have not gone out those revolving doors and have died in the hotel that night? What if what happened to Chris was, what, payback? Okay, babe, I think you need to shut up. Dude, what she's saying now sounds ridiculous. Listen to her, it has to mean something. You saved our lives, Carly, but what you're saying is insane. Sue also gives even more bad news of a hurricane that is coming towards Mexico, and so they may have to stay here even longer than they were hoping, because obviously they wanted to leave after Chris's death, but they may not be able to if there's a hurricane coming. And that's when Jake shows up, and Brian gets a call on the phone, and apparently there were 3 other Americans that were on the plane with Carly and heard her talking about the hotel explosion, and so they didn't go to the hotel either, which means it's very possible that they were supposed to die and that they might be in danger. Garcia notices that the doors have been blown open, even though there's no wind, which is real suspicious. And Jake notices that Carly's pen is leaking, which is really weird. It's broken and the fluids from the pen are leaking out. Meanwhile, Katie is sitting in nearby hospital room with a thermometer in her mouth, trying to chill out. She accidentally drops the thermometer, and because she's shaking, it hits the ground, cracks open. She picks it back up, puts it in her mouth, and there's a skeleton right behind her. And when she puts the thermometer back in her mouth, the mercury inside of it comes out of the thermometer, and she swallows it, and mercury is poisonous. So she tries spitting it out. She starts stumbling around. She steps on a couple of scissors, which causes her to trip over into the nearby skeleton. She falls on top of it, and the ribs of the skeleton stab straight through her torso, killing her. So that's our second death. And it's a very unfortunate position that she's left in. Weirdly sexual for some reason. There's also a gnarly shot of, like, a bone sticking out of her arm. So everyone's reactions to Chris and Katie's deaths are different. You know, Carly and Matt are kind of freaked out trying to figure out the situation. Meanwhile, Brian is trying to be more level-headed and calm everyone down. And Jake is just like, no, Carly and Matt are right. We need to be afraid. And we need to figure out what's happening so that we don't end up like Chris and Katie. And so they go and meet with the 3 people that called them on the phone, that called Brian on the phone. Drina, Jeremy, and Gino, who were on the same aeroplane as our main characters. They overheard Carly talking and they decided not to check into the hotel that night, which means they're probably on death's list as well. Carly figures out the order that they're all going to die in by looking at the plans of the hotel, where she says that the explosions that she drew go in the order of the rooms that they all stayed in. So, Esperanza was first, and then under her room, like the next rooms after that were Chris and Katie, so they were next. And the next room after that is Gino. We also see more of them where it goes Gino, Drina, Jeremy, Amanda, Matt, Jake, Brian, and then finally Carly. So that is the order that they will die in. So they decide to all get together in a group and head to some Mayan ruins for the day. And when they go there, Carly and Jake meet a Mayan priest. They don't really... I'm sorry if that's wrong. I think that's what he is. He's like a Mayan priest. He takes them into a nearby cave and he says a whole bunch of ominous, creepy stuff that really freaks Carly out. So she runs out of the cave. And Brian's just like, hey, what happened? And Jake's just like... Carly got freaked out. And Brian's like, alright, I'll take over. And he just pushes Jake out of the way and comforts Carly. They continue looking through the Mayan ruins, where Jake points out that Ix-Chel, the moon goddess, looks a lot like Carly, suspiciously. They decide to then head back into the car and go diving, where Jake turns to Carly and says that her pen has accidentally dripped into his dictionary, and they open it up to see a couple of like ink spots that kind of look a little bit like blood spots. So they go diving. Jake and Gino go diving together alongside the detective. And so Carly thinks that Jake might be in danger, and so she's like, oh, be careful. And she looks into the ocean, she sees that there's no air bubbles. And down below, Gino is just like swimming around and then all of a sudden his air tank gets bitten by an eel, causing all the air to start shooting out of it, which jets, like, it propels Gino up into the boat, and he crashes through the bottom of the boat, and then a shard of glass falls into his mouth, stabbing through his throat, killing him. It's pretty messed up. After that, the group head to the aeroplane that Sue has managed to get for them so that they can leave Mexico. But Carly notices that it's Flight 180, which gives her a huge uneasy feeling because Flight 180 is the plane from the original Final Destination that blew up. And it's a reoccurring number in this franchise. It's like a death omen. And so she's like, oh, I can feel it. And so she tries to get away, and Jake's just like, hey, where are you going? And she sees a nearby forklift, and there's a forklift driver, and he suddenly gets a heart attack, and he stops the forklift, or like he presses down on the lever, and it causes the forklift to start shooting up, and it stabs directly through, like straight through Sue's chest, like just straight through her. I don't know why she died. I guess she was supposed to be in the hospital or something, but yeah, she dies, and then the forklift goes straight through the terminal that they're walking through, like the bridge, ripping it open, causing Drina to fall over the edge to her death. And it continues just ripping apart the entire bridge. And so Jeremy falls down onto the metal, killing him as well. And so Drina, Gino, and Jeremy are all dead, and now Sue's dead too, as well as the forklift driver. Like, Death is killing people in order to kill other people. Yeah. Pretty damn messed up. I was not expecting Sue's death. I'm kind of sad she died, because she was one of the more likable characters in this, despite being pretty one-dimensional. So after those traumatizing events, obviously the flights are cancelled, and so the group is forced to head back to Carly's apartment with Detective Garcia, where it's pointed out that because there's a hurricane coming, they're setting off all the fireworks early just so that they don't get disrupted by the hurricane. Carly starts going through her computer, and she realizes that on her computer was an architectural drawing of the forklift going straight through the, like, plane terminal. Like the bridge. Which she does not remember ever putting on there, but it's in line with everything that's happened so far. And this is when they finally say, officially, they finally figure out that Death is coming after them one at a time, in order. And so Amanda and Matt are like, wait, so who's next? And everyone looks at Amanda. It's like, Matt, do you really think? Just calm down, hon. It's just a guess. She doesn't know for sure what's going on here. So Garcia tells them to all remain in the hotel, and they even board the hotel up so that nothing can get in. And yeah, the group feels safe for now. Carly goes to a vending machine where she decides to get a drink. She's met by Jake, or Brian. I don't know who it's supposed to be. I think it's supposed to be Jake. The love triangle between them continues. I'm not sure who she's supposed to be with. I think she's with Brian, and Jake is interested in her, and Carly reciprocates those feelings. I don't know. It's really hard to tell. It's really confusing. So Brian comes over and is like, hey, careful, those things can fall over and kill you. So the group continues going through the hotel, where they see like a bucket of spilled water, so they're being extra cautious with going around. They decide to spend the night in the hot tub, and Amanda complains that the hot tub is too hot, so she decides to go into the nearby pool, and they're all like, hey, like, we're supposed to stick together. If we're in a group, we'll be fine. And Amanda's like, I'm only going to be a few feet away. So she goes for a swim, and the electronics in the hot tub begin to fritz out, and that causes the controls of the pool cover to fritz out as well. And so the cover of the pool begins shutting over the pool, and so Amanda sees that and is like, and like tries to get out of the pool, but it covers it, and she gets caught underneath the cover, and it suffocates her to death. And the rest of her friends find her body underneath the cover. It's actually kind of a cool shot, seeing the imprint of her body under the cover. It's pretty horrifying. Some of the most horrifying deaths in the Final Destination series are the least goriest ones, just like suffocating. Like, could you imagine? So Matt suddenly freaks out, and he starts blaming Carly, saying like, if you said that if we stuck together, like, none of us would die, and look what just happened, like, Amanda's dead. And so he runs away, and he smashes through the boards of the hotel. And so they're just like, oh, he'll be fine, like, he'll be back. And Carly's like, no, he won't, because Matt's next on Death's list. She's like, Matt, stop. Matt continues running, and he almost gets hit by a truck. It just goes, and he, like, jumps out of the way. And then he continues running. He actually sees a vision of the priest from earlier warning him. But he continues running anyway, and he runs straight into the line of fire of all the fireworks that were being set off. And one of them gets set off at him, and Matt bursts into flames as he screams. It ends as if it's kind of like a cliffhanger, but I'm pretty sure Matt didn't survive this. It would be funny if we went into the next issue and he's just like in hospital with burns. So with Matt dead now, Jake, Brian, and Carly are the only ones remaining. Carly gets a call from Garcia that they're sending a helicopter in to grab them, as the hurricane is now coming in and it's too dangerous for them to remain where they are. So Jake and Carly, profess their love for each other and kiss, while Brian watches, annoyed. I still don't know. I thought Brian was with Carly, but I guess it switched to Jake Or did I say Chris? I meant Jake. Jake and Carly kiss. Yeah, I guess it switched to Jake. I still can't figure out which is which at times. At least it's a little easier now that there's only the three of them. So they all head to the rooftop as the helicopter comes in to get them. And the winds from the helicopter almost knock Carly over the edge of the building, but Jake grabs her. He's like, "Gotcha, babe." And so he's holding on to Carly, and Brian's holding on to him. He's like, "It's okay, babe. I'm here. Nothing's going to happen to you." And so the helicopter lands, and Jake's like, "All right, when it lands, we got to move fast. The wind could change direction any second." And Jake's like, "Almost." And he's like, "Now." And Carly's like, "No, Jake, not yet." And Jake runs towards the helicopter as the spirit of the priest appears in front of him. The helicopter gets knocked by the winds, which causes it to tilt towards Jake, and the blades of the helicopter rip Jake apart as Carly is like, "Jake!" He just goes, Jake's just like, "Huh," and he gets just ripped apart. It's pretty... Like, this is probably the most gruesome death in the book. And most of these deaths are heavily censored. Surprised they even got away with this. But yeah, this is definitely the goriest one. It's pretty messed up. And so the helicopter then explodes, so Brian and Carly quickly duck in the nearby building away from the explosion. So it turns out that one of the guys on the helicopter that explodes was Garcia. When I first recorded this, I didn't even know, that it was him. I went on the wiki page later and found out that it was supposed to be him because the book doesn't tell you it's him at all, and it's kind of hard to see what he looks like because of all the fire and stuff and the quick cuts in the different panels. But yeah, that was him, and he died in the helicopter crash. The fires from the explosion and the pieces of the helicopter that crash into the building cause the boiler room to leak, and Brian's next on the list, so he's like, "We gotta get out of here, because, this place is gonna blow, and both of us will die." And so, they make their way through the building. They manage to, dodge a tree, which gets thrown through a nearby window that almost kills Brian. It's like they're both cheating death multiple times, and so it keeps swapping between them. Brian almost gets killed by a tree. As they leave through the window, Carly gets cut by some glass and gets the blood on Brian's shirt, which freaks her out. They continue making their way through the stormy waters as the building behind them explodes. Luckily, they got to safety. They continue making their way through the hurricane, and a sign, a truck almost kills Brian, but they manage to dodge it. A sign almost kills them both, but they manage to duck it. And they head into a nearby funeral store, where coffins and things are. Carly's like, "It's over. We cheated death a second time. It came full circle when Castle Royale exploded. We're no longer in its design. We just have to survive this storm." And Brian's like, "All right, get in there. We'll be safe inside." So they both get into a couple of coffins, and that's when the roof caves in on both of them, and Carly, from within her coffin, hears a bunch of noises and a big crack. She opens the coffin. She's like, "Brian?" She pulls all of the wood off of Brian's coffin, and she opens it up to find that Brian is dead inside the coffin because the wood crushed him inside it. And so that causes her to freak out. She's just like, "Ah!" And then all of a sudden, she looks at her hands. She sees the blood on her hands, and then she sees the reflection of a mirror. She sees the priest, and he says a whole lot of confusing things. He says, "The wise think now the gods are satisfied, yes, and have brought an end to those whom they are satisfied. They are satisfied not, yes. Goddess of the weave, you reveal your design, yes. Goddess of the moon, you cast your dark light, yes. Oh my god. No, child, my god are you. Yes, like the Maya Ixchel must vanish." So, I think what it's saying is that Carly is the god of death, and was the one responsible. That's why she was drawing all of the, her architecture drawings were predicting the deaths. It's because she was the god of death, and she was unknowingly doing, this whole thing. Pretty sure that's what it's saying. It's a very confusing ending, a very anticlimactic ending as well. I thought Brian's death was pretty anticlimactic. The best death in this was definitely Jake's because of how gory it was. Chris's death was pretty good too. I liked the Rube Goldbergian nature of his death and the fact that you didn't know if it was going to be him or Jake that was going to die. Like, they kind of hinted at both of them. Overall, I found this series to be similar enough to the movies that I enjoyed it, but I think it lacked... Like, I think it suffered from being a 5-issue miniseries. Like, it could have been a little bit longer. I think some of the deaths were heavily rushed. Some of them we didn't even really get to see in full, like Matt's death. Like, we got to see him get set alight by fireworks, but we didn't even see the aftermath. It just immediately cut to the next, story beat. I also think that this could have done with a little bit more humor. I think that's one thing that it was lacking. This comic was very serious, and I think if it had a little bit more humor in it, I think it probably would have been better just to kind of separate from the deaths. But I guess they just didn't have time because you could tell that they were kind of rushing through it, having to kill off these characters. They had those 3 characters that were introduced that were killed off immediately. In fact, that moment was really cool when the forklift killed Sue. I was not expecting that, and it ripped apart the entire bridge, killing all 3 characters at the same time. 4 if you count the forklift driver. Poor dude. But yeah, that was Final Destination Spring Break. It's actually the only Final Destination comic that has been made, disappointingly. I think Final Destination is one of those things that makes a great premise for a comic book series, like an anthology comic series. So I really hope that, this new movie that comes out sparks the franchise again, and we get more things than just a movie. A Final Destination video game would be amazing, where, like, your aim is to try and survive and cheat death. Like, that would be really cool, and the decisions that you make determine how far you get into the game and the ways that people die. Like, it would be similar to Until Dawn, but Final Destination. That'd be a really cool thing. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I enjoyed making it. I love this franchise, and it was great being able to take a look at this comic book series and share it with everyone. And next week, I will begin covering Amazon's Attack, the DC event centered all around Wonder Woman. So look forward to that.